Hi there, this is Mr. Fowles. Today we're going to talk about George Washington, first president, which kind of gives away the first bellwork answer. The first president of the U.S. was George Washington. The president's job, we just got done studying the Constitution, so you should know that the job is to execute the laws, make sure that the laws are put in place and adhered to. Government raises money by taxes. Hope you knew that. Some other different types of taxes, but primarily it's taxation. And the foundation for all American law is the Constitution. So this is Mount Rushmore, and it contains some famous faces that you should know. George Washington, I'm going to really hope you know this. This gentleman over here on the left is Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, and not sure I don't know why there's no one between Roosevelt and Lincoln. I don't think they were enemies. They didn't live at the same time. Well, one was old and one was young, perhaps. But there's really nothing in between them there. Kind of strange. Anywho, this is George Washington, another artistic rendition, and the famous story is that he chopped down the cherry tree and he couldn't lie about it. Cannot tell a lie. He had to be careful as president. He was selected as president after the Constitutional Convention. He led the Constitutional Convention. He was a military hero. He was pretty popular. So he was an easy pick for the first president from the electors, and he had to be careful because everything he did would set a precedent. So it's kind of funny that a president set a precedent. But it's an example that's going to be followed. For example, when he was sworn in, from there on he preferred being called Mr. President as opposed to Your Excellency. John Adams wanted to call him Your Excellency, but he kind of backed off that and just said, Mr. President will be fine. And how he led his government, he appointed a cabinet, different advisors, Secretary of War, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, Postmaster General. So in forming these offices and using them as advisors and how he talked to them, he definitely established an example for others to follow. He was sworn in on April 30th, 1789. It's important as a counterpoint to understand that he did own enslaved labor for most of his life. Some people would say he was a slave owner. I say he owned enslaved labor. When he died, he left a will that said that the enslaved people would be set free upon his wife's death. She freed them 1 year after his death, and I guess the story is that she was afraid that they would rise up against her and kill her to earn their own freedom. That's the going story. Whatever truth there is to it, it's kind of been lost in history, but that's, as much as this story is told, that's how it goes. There's some verbal check questions. Why do you think he wanted to be called Mr. President? Well, he didn't want the office of president to be like the king. That was kind of where this whole thing started, was anger with the king. So why emulate the King of England if you don't want to be like the King of England? And what qualifications did he have? Well, he didn't, he was a military leader, and he was a public figure, but there really were no qualifications to be president. He defined what those qualifications were, but he definitely had the respect of the nation. A nation that had money problems, like this gentleman here in the picture. The government still had a lot of debt from the Revolutionary War, and had tried levying taxes under the Articles of Confederation, which led to Shays' Rebellion and all that. So the Constitution was written to make a strong federal government that would help do it, because the U.S. was in debt $52 million, which is about $1.4 billion in current currency as of 2014, according to Wolfram Alpha. And the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, he wanted to pay this debt off, because a lot of the debt was to soldiers from the Revolutionary War. So he intended to do that by creating a national bank basically he wanted to purchase. If you look at this video here, if you click on it in the presentation, you can download it, it's really nifty. It shows how the intent was to purchase all the IOUs from the soldiers, and well, first assume the debt of all the states, purchase those IOUs from the private investors bought them from the soldiers, and the bank was going to pay them from the investors, build them from the investors, and then have this debt and use that to build an economy. So it's kind of foundation within the bank, and so the bank had the debt, and the bank worked to pay it off by making loans and being a national bank, which would bring a lot of private interest into public affairs. And this is Alexander Hamilton. You can just pause and read that and meditate. Thomas Jefferson was very much opposed to a national bank. He did not want all these private industry mixed up in public government. And it's kind of prescient of him because now we have the Federal Reserve, which is a private industry connected to public government. So we're kind of reliving that currently. But Thomas Jefferson did not believe in a strong central bank. So he definitely had some issues with this, and he actually ended up resigning. But this led to the creation of political parties. The Democratic Republicans with Thomas Jefferson, and the Federalists with Alexander Hamilton. And here's a little picture you can look at. And this is kind of what they cared about. Federalists preferred a loose interpretation of the Constitution, meaning that there's a clause, an elastic clause, that says that the government has the power to do whatever it needs to do to achieve its goal. Whereas the Democratic Republicans felt like a strict interpretation was more appropriate, whereby they followed the letter of the Constitution, not the spirit thereof. So the two parties believed differently about the Constitution and how it should be applied to government. So, kind of a question, think about which one of these parties do you think you would belong to? Democratic Republicans or the Federalists? And I guess some classwork too. And Hamilton wanted to start a bank to help pay off the national debt. Jefferson was opposed to that plan because it would marry public and private interests, and Democratic Republicans and Federalists were different because they believed in different applications of the Constitution to U.S. government. So, after the government was established and began having taxing authority and levying taxes directly, there was a big tax on whiskey, and this was I guess it'd be like an excise tax, a luxury tax on this one product, and a tax on the manufacture of whiskey that had to get paid to the federal government. And these farmers in western Pennsylvania who needed whiskey for their economic activity, they were farmers who, made and traded whiskey. They revolted against this tax and they refused to pay it. And it was very similar to the pre-revolutionary, rebellion. It was called the Whiskey Rebellion, aptly named, because it was about whiskey. And there's a link there. You can watch a short and cute video. And the solution to this revolution was the army. And Washington sent the army to crush the rebellion, and it worked. They weren't heard from again. So this is another example in our kind of long history of using military might to crush domestic insurrection. Be that as it may, that is part of our history, and so we deal with it. Why did it occur? Tax on whiskey. And then there were troubles abroad too. While in this late 18th century, over in France, there was something called the French Revolution, and essentially it was the overthrowing of the monarchy. And as you can see in the picture, there was citizens fighting against troops and a lot of death everywhere. And Thomas Jefferson, he wanted to support the French people against the French government. He thought that the French people were doing just what the Americans had done, and that the French had helped the Americans, so the Americans should help the French. Washington, however, chose to be neutral, which is this word here, and it means to not take a side, to just stay back. Jefferson was the Secretary of State, which is kind of like an official diplomat. He was so angry he resigned. He didn't want any more of Washington's government, so he quit. At the same time, England had started looting. Looting means attacking and taking things. Cargo ships that were headed from the French West Indies, because England and France have their perpetual enmity, which means their long-lasting hatred towards each other. And so, while American ships were trading out of the French West Indies, Britain started sinking their boats and taking their money. They weren't military ships, they were trading ships, so they weren't well armed. And then within America itself, you have to remember that west of the Mississippi was Spanish territory, so we can still kind of call it abroad. America had border tension with Spain. We read how Spain was arming, for example, Chickamaugan warriors fighting against Western settlers because they were afraid of settlers coming into Spanish territory, and so there was tension, kind of all tension with France, tension with Britain, tension with Spain. Of course, there was no tension with France. Tensions came as a result of what was happening in France. So that's a lot of problems there. And so we had some solutions in the form of some treaties here. To solve that issue with England, where England was kind of looting cargo ships, John Jay was a diplomat, and they put out a treaty which helped reduce frontier tensions, for one, because there were still some English forts out in the west, and also favorable terms regarding the looting and sinking of American trade ships. And then there was a treaty with Spain called Pinckney's Treaty, which gave America the right to use the Mississippi and to use the port of New Orleans, which is a major shipping port. Otherwise, things would have to get taken out to the Atlantic coast. And then there was some negotiation regarding Florida, and this also helped ease that tension in, for example, what is now Middle Tennessee and other just easing conflicts. So these two treaties definitely helped Washington make peace with foreign countries. It didn't help the split with Thomas Jefferson, of course. And there's that. Why did he send the army against people who were making whiskey? Because they rebelled against his high taxes, and events in Europe affected American politics, because the French Revolution led to a split between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. A further split, we should say, because they'd already split over the issue of the bank, and this was just another like driving the wedge farther in. So this is George Washington, a quote. He was a good writer, I think. Conscience, Celestial Fire, good stuff. And that's your exit slip. Was his leadership indispensable in successfully launching the new federal government? Of all these things that occurred, would we be where we are today had it not been for the choices Washington made? I know we really just glossed over his presidency, but you can think about, what if he hadn't made a cabinet? What if he had capitulated and helped France? What if that had been the example he set? How could that change? Was he a good president? No. Kind of have to base that on what we have now. He did, think about the Whiskey Rebellion, think about, but he did have, under his leadership, those treaties were signed that reduced problems with Spain and England. And then how did the first political parties form? Think about reaction to the National Bank, and then reaction to the French Revolution. And put your answer down. All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.